Hi, everybody. This is Professor Ian. This is my video lecture about narrative poetry and more specifically the ballad. We're going to focus more on that. Traditionally, people like to talk about poetry having, roughly three genres: narrative poetry, dramatic poetry, and lyrical poetry. And so this is focusing on one of those three big genres, narrative poetry. And so narrative poetry, is it the oldest form of poetry? I put a question mark there because, who knows? But I think it's safe to say that humans have always been telling stories, and probably poetry was used to tell these stories, to make it musical, to make it memorable, to add, listening pleasure to it, also skill. Narrative poetry is as old as written records allow us to look back. Of course, narrative poetry tells a story. That's the main defining feature of a narrative poem. It is a poem that is telling a story. So it has, a narrative poem will have setting, plot, theme, characters, all the other features we might associate with a short story or a novel or any other written story or told story. So an example from The Raven. This is the first stanza. See, I almost said paragraph like a story. First stanza of The Raven from Poe. Pardon me. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over many quaint and curious volumes of forgotten lore, while I nodded nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of one gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. Only this and nothing more. So you can see that it has, this is setting up a scene for us. As if, if this was written as a short story, it would be about a man busy in the library and he hears a knock at the door. So we get setting, right? We get a little bit about the character, immediately set up, we're moving towards kind of the conflict of the story, or in this case, the poem, right? Here's, there's an interruption to this man's solitary pursuits of knowledge in the library. He's not thrilled about it. And we can see, it's moving towards that conflict or climax of the story, right? So you have all these kind of narrative features in this very first paragraph of The Raven. But narrative poetry, like other forms of poetry, uses those poetic elements we're talking about: rhythm, symbolism, rhyme, concise imagery, right? Because it's not a longer story. The Raven is, I can't remember how many stanzas, 6 stanzas long, maybe a bit longer, but it's very, compared to if you read a Poe short story, The Raven is a very concise story, right? It's a very concise story with a very concise and tight imagery compared to his stories. And that's of course due to the length and the nature of poetry, right? Poetry is all about that concise imagery that carries, does more work than perhaps it does in fiction. So if we take a look at the first stanza of The Raven from a more poetic point of view, I've underlined some of the rhyming words. So once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary, we have this internal rhyme creating rhythm. Over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, rhymes with door here, and more. So the rhyme scheme would be, we could write it as A, B, C, A, or A, B, C, B, 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 right? Creating a really strong kind of rhythm, right? Those end rhymes, lore, door, more, but also the internal rhymes, right? Dreary, weary. We have napping, tapping, rapping, tapping, right? A lot of those ing rhyme words in this part, creating a real rhythm as you're reading it. Notice too, the repetition: rapping at my chamber door, tapping at my chamber door, right? This is a pattern he follows a lot in this poem. There's a lot of alliteration, which is another poetic element that we use, right? While I pondered weak and weary, getting that W sound, really hitting that. Or while I nodded nearly napping, creating that rhythm again with the alliteration. So we have all these poetic elements. We also have, if you're familiar with the poem, this stanza ends, only this and nothing more. So nothing is a term or a word that gets repeated throughout the poem. It becomes a kind of leitmotif, right? A motif throughout the poem. So you can see that The Raven has both elements, right? It's telling a story, it has character, setting, conflict. It also has many of these poetic elements: rhythm, rhyme, imagery, so on and so forth. Okay. Narrative poetry, we see this in much contemporary poetry, right? Again, narrative poetry is just telling a story, so we can describe a lot of poems as having narrative elements or being narrative poems. There's also a lot of traditional forms of the narrative poem. We saw in the lecture on rhyming couplets, I talked about the epic. So the epic is an example of narrative poetry. So, a long serious poem which tells the story of a hero. So the Iliad is a famous example. We also have idyls, so a poem about either an idealized country scene or about the heroes of yesteryear, right? More of so not really telling like the Iliad's all about the battle of Achilles, right? Whereas an idyll is more about just singing the praises, right? So, for example, Milton has a famous poem, his Lycidias, not as famous as his Paradise Lost, of course, but it's a famous poem nonetheless. And a form of poetry, we don't use anymore called the lay. It's a long poem that was used by medieval minstrels to tell, the news of the land. And again, you can see why narrative poetry, this is before the printing press was used to produce newspapers and things like this and the internet and all that stuff. So people would go around singing the news, and to have it in musical form would make it easier to listen to and to memorize and repeat. So the lay was an important form way back when. Of course, we don't use that anymore. And of course, the other traditional form that I'm going to talk about a bit more is the ballad, which we still definitely use. A lot of music that we listen to now is written in the ballad form. The ballad is associated with folk traditions. It goes back, further than we have, or a long ways, and was often passed down as part of an oral tradition. As long as we can go back to Chaucer was writing ballads. As long as we have English poetry, we have ballads. So it was first circulated in print via cheap written mediums such as the broadside. It's called the broadside. It was a one-page printed document, often had a woodcut at the top, and a woodcut is like a picture that is carved out of wood, literally carved out of wood, and then it would be printed onto the page, right? So it's called a woodcut. And it was one of the earliest and most popular products of the early printing presses of the 15th century in Europe. So, this innovation of the printing presses, of course, they were printing Bibles and other important works, but they were also printing a ton of these broadsides, these cheap, um, uh, often cheaply produced and of cheap quality documents that would be sold for very little to people so they could learn these new songs and repeat these poems that were going around. So the broadsides usually focused on salacious contemporary crimes, murders and scandals, famous historical events, big battles, that kind of stuff, and heavy-handed morality. So tales of young women going astray or the dangers of alcohol, things like that, would be the feature of this. Just dramatic things that make for good stories. So here's a couple examples of what broadsides look like. This one's a bit older. The one on the left, Annette and the Soldier. And we have this one. And this is what I meant by a woodcut. So this is an image that was carved out of wood and would be printed onto the page of paper using the printing press. Okay. There's a great broadside collection. I think it's UC Santa Clara. I think they have the collection. They have tons and tons of these, and they're really fun to look at. And you can look at them online, so that's why I'm pointing that out. It's fun. Anyway, so some characteristics of the ballad. They often historically the traditional ones deal with the supernatural. So we often have a lot of supernatural elements in these ballads. They're often characterized by tragic or sad outcomes, almost always traditionally. They have these sad or tragic endings. They're not usually light tales of romance. Sometimes they're humorous, but more often they are tragic and sad. They often include dialogue. These are meant to be, stories. So dialogue helps us characterize things in stories. And they often use a repeated refrain, like a chorus or a beginning and an ending. It's like a repeated stanza. And this helps create a musical rhythm. And this is what I mean. We're used to the ballad form in our music as well. You probably heard the term power ballad and things like that. And this is going back to this form of poetry. So stanzas are usually quatrains or sestets, and those are fancy words for 4 or 6 lines, right? So a stanza with 4 lines we call a quatrain. A stanza with 6 lines we call a sestet. You can have quintets, and you can have other fancy sounding words for stanzas. That's the usual structure. Um, and they usually have a clear rhyme scheme, usually A B A B A B C B, so the second and the fourth line rhyme, or rhyming couplets A A B B C C. And they usually alternate to create a rhythm between 4 and 3 stresses. So you get to do to do to do to do in the first line, then to do to do to do, and usually in that iambic pentameter as well. It's a real musical kind of pentameter. So here's a couple examples. Here's from The Cremation of Sam McGee by Robert Service. Now, Sam McGee was from Tennessee, where the cotton blooms and blows. Why he left his home in the South to roam around the pole, God only knows. He was always cold, but the land of gold seemed to hold him like a spell, though he'd often say in his homely way that he'd sooner live in hell. So it goes on. It's a really fun poem if you haven't read it before, but you get these rhyming couplets: blows, knows, spell, hell. Also the great internal rhyme. I think in every line I have to go through the poem again carefully, but you get this. He was always cold, but the land of gold seemed to hold him like a spell. So he's creating rhythm that way, right, rather than using the 4/3 stress structure. But he's got this real musical structure to that poem. And here's Annabel Lee by Poe. This is a bit of a different rhyme structure, but I just want to show you this one. It was many and many a year ago in a kingdom by the sea that a maiden there lived whom you may know by the name of Annabel Lee. And as maiden she lived with no other thought than to love and live to be loved to love and be loved by me. I'm sorry, I screwed up that last line. Anyway, so you can see this one's like, if we did the rhyme structure, it's A, B, and this is actually rhymes here, right? No and a go. So A, B, C, B, right? So the second, fourth, and sixth line of this sestet rhyme, creating that rhyme structure. And then in this one, these two rhyme, but that isn't always the case in Annabel Lee. Most of the stanzas, the first and third lines don't rhyme. It's just the second, fourth, and sixth rhyme. And notice that the second, fourth, and sixth are also shorter. That's that 4/3 stress. It was many and many a year ago in a kingdom by the sea, right? So longer line, shorter line, longer line, shorter line, creating that rhythm with the rhyme structure. Again, that musical feel. So I thought I'd just conclude by looking at the Cowboy's Lament. This is a traditional American folk song. It has roots in the European tradition. It comes from an older ballad called The Unfortunate Rake, or at least that's what musicologists and people who study poetry and folk traditions and such trace it back to. And here, one of the fun things too is this migration between written and oral traditions that goes on with the ballad, because obviously a lot of this is hidden by the sands of history, but they think that a lot of the written poetry in the broadsides in the 15th century and later come from oral traditions, and then came into writing and got refined in writing, and then went back to oral traditions. So you had the Unfortunate Rake, which was a written ballad that circulated in Europe. We have many copies and versions of that, which became this song here, which became oral, like an oral tradition amongst Americans in the 19th and 18th century probably, and then came into writing again. So it's really interesting to think about how they move around. So I won't go through the poem in great depth, but I just wanted to show you a little bit. And if you click on the link of that's Frank Maynard, who claims that he wrote this version of the poem. He was a famous cowboy from American history. If you click on this, it'll take you to Johnny Cash's version called The Streets of Laredo, which is the Cowboy's Lament. So let me just read the first stanza. I walked out in the streets of Laredo. As I walked out in Laredo one day, I spied a young cowboy all wrapped in white linen as cold as the clay. So you get A, B, C, B. It's a rhyme structure, right? One of the most common rhyme structures. You get in the next stanza, I see by your outfit that you are a cowboy. These words he did say as I boldly walked by. So you get dialogue, right? They're in a conversation. You get a lot of repeated imagery, a lot of repetition in the lines. In the third and fourth stanzas, get 16 gamblers to carry my coffin, get 6 jolly cowboys to sing me a song, and then get 6 jolly cowboys to carry my coffin, get 6 pretty maidens to sing me a song. Right? A lot of repetition, very musical, song-like. And then and it's a story, right? The first